So this is the terms video for chapter 14. We're going to talk a lot about different ways that small organisms work in the ocean and what role they play. So the first term is called accessory pigment. Accessory pigment refers to any additional structure, usually pigment, that allows a plant or something that photosynthesizes to do something creative. Usually accessory pigments are types of chlorophyll. And so chlorophyll is what gives, if you look at a green leaf is green because of the chlorophyll. That's the color. So there's different colors as well. There's yellow and orange. I can't remember there's blue. There's all sorts of different colors. And these colors absorb light at different wavelengths. So we'll talk a lot more about accessory pigments. Algae refers to any plant that lives in or is found in water. So if you go to a pond, you might see some algae. If you go to the beach, you might see some algae, water. Autotroph, we talked about in chapter 13, is something that makes its own energy, a plant, right? It captures sunlight, makes energy. Bioluminescence refers to the ability of a lot of, I'm trying to think if there's any plants. Well, actually some mushrooms do it. Ability of an organism to produce light. So for example, if you've ever seen a firefly at night in South Carolina, they have a little glowing rear end. Some mushrooms glow at night. Some diatoms glow at night. So if you've ever been to the beach and when the waves are breaking at night and there's no light, the water looks kind of like really kind of bright blue, like someone's shining a bright blue light. That's bioluminescence. A lot of squid do it, a lot of fish do it. It's very common, actually. Biomass is a term I want you to know. Biomass refers to, it's a very specific term. It refers to the amount of carbon in an area. So for example, if I want to measure the biomass of a plant, I can go out to a field, measure 1 meter by 1 meter, cut all the grass and weigh it. And that weight, grams, kilograms, however much it is, per unit area, that's biomass. And biomass is a number that we use to compare. So if you want to say, we're getting more and more fish, you can measure the biomass and see how it's going up. Or if you're saying we're losing fish, you can show how the biomass is going down. So it's a very handy way to provide data. Chemosynthesis, talked about this in the previous chapter, but it's just using chemicals instead of sunlight to make energy. That's all that is. Coccolithophore, we talked about this a long time ago when we were talking about calcareous oozes. So coccolithophores, they're microscopic little organisms that live in the ocean. The cliffs of Dover are made out of them. They're kind of cool, but don't worry about them. Compensation depth can mean a variety of different things. I think for this chapter, what they're talking about is if you're in the photic zone, you're photosynthesizing. If you're in the aphotic zone, you're not photosynthesizing. If you're kind of in the transition between the two, you can produce enough energy to survive, to compensate. That depth is that depth. Cyanobacterium is a specific type of bacteria. If you've ever been to Yellowstone National Park in, where is that, Wyoming, Montana, central United States, there's a lot of cyanobacteria. Cyanobacteria are really well adapted for very difficult environments, hydrothermal vents, very salty, hypertonic solutions. They're very diverse for sure. Diatom is a microscopic plant that lives in the ocean. We talked about diatoms previously with when we were talking about oozes made out of silica, siliceous oozes. Diatoms have the glass shell. They're plants. Dinoflagellates are also plants. They're the ones that, I'm trying to think how to describe them. They're so hard to describe because there's such diversity. Dinoflagellates, what I want you to know is it's a different type of microscopic plant, right? It's not a diatom, let's put it that way. We'll come back to dinoflagellates in a little bit when we talk about harmful algal blooms. Extremophile is anything that lives in an extreme environment, typically really hot, really cold, really salty, things like that, right? Extremophile, right? So cyanobacteria, many of them are considered extremophile. Flagellum is a structure found on a lot of organisms, specifically in this case, dinoflagellate, right? Flagellum. And it's essentially a structure that you can kind of think of it like a tail. Think of it kind of like a monkey's tail. And the organism can kind of control it. It's used to move around, right? So it's kind of like, it acts like a motor, really, the way it functions. So they kind of spin it, if this is a flagellum, you're spinning it around and it moves you a little bit. Now you might not be able to move as straight as you want, but you're able to move maybe out of the way of a predator or towards food or towards light, things like that. Frustule, frustule is the glass part of a diatom. So if you have a diatom and you look at the skeleton, the pieces of the skeleton is essentially two pieces. There's generally a big piece and a little piece, and they kind of fit like that. Those are called frustrules. HABs it's an acronym for harmful algal blooms. These are algae, typically, not always, typically dinoflagellates, sometimes diatoms, sometimes cyanobacteria, but generally dinoflagellates. These are bacteria, harmful algal blooms. These are species of plants, typically, that live in the water that produce toxins. Now, I know what you're going to say. Cyanobacteria are not plants, 100%. However, the name is stuck, right? So harmful algal blooms is essentially anything in the water that produces a toxin, right? And you may have heard about this with fish kills in Florida, or like closing of oyster hatcheries, things like that. These are naturally occurring plants. They produce toxins that are potentially deadly to humans, whales, seals. They're serious for sure. Heterotroph, something that can't make its own energy, it has to consume an autotroph, like a cow. Kelp is a very specific type of seaweed, typically found in cold water, like California, Africa. I'm trying to think of other places. I think there's some in Maine, the Northeast United States. They're a very specific type of seaweed that lives in the ocean. Mangrove, talked about this when we were talking about estuaries. Mangrove is a type of tree that lives in the ocean. They look kind of like a normal tree from the roots up, but their roots, they have these things called air roots. So they kind of look like stilts, kind of, and they kind of have these supporting structures, and they form huge forests, especially in Florida. Manatees use them a lot. It's essentially it's an estuary, right? It's a nursery. So mangroves are the tree. Microbial loop refers to a part of the ocean's food web that is fairly new. I think it was the 1990s when it was discovered. And it's essentially scientists recognizing that bacteria, microbes, are an important role in the ocean, especially if you recall from chapter 13, we were talking about dissolved organic carbon. That dissolved organic carbon is the food for the microbial loop. Multicellular algae, is algae made out of more than one cell. Some algae are single cell. Some, like kelp, are multicellular. Right? That's all it is. So kelp would be a multicellular algae. Nekton is anything that can control where it moves in the ocean water. Right? So we talked about plankton. Actually, let's go ahead and do that. Plankton is anything in the water that cannot control where it goes. It just kind of drifts about. Nekton can control where it's going. So a good example of nekton is a fish or squid, right? They can swim. They want to go there, they go there, right? A jellyfish doesn't have that option. It can kind of move a little bit, but it can't move kind of directly. Non-conservative nutrient is a nutrient that has non-conservative behavior. So recall when we were talking about conservative and non-conservative elements, like sodium is conservative, doesn't change, but oxygen is non-conservative because it changes because of biology in the water. Same thing with nutrients, right? Nitrogen and phosphorus. Those are the two big ones you need to know about. Phytoplankton, microscopic plants that live in the ocean. They're plants, so they capture sunlight, produce oxygen. Picoplankton is a very specific group of typically, well, no. Picoplankton is very small plankton. I forgot what pico is. I think 10 to the minus 9th. It's really small stuff. Like even with a good microscope, you can't see picoplankton. It's really hard to see. A plankton, I have no idea what they're referencing here. Don't worry about it. Plankton, we just talked about, things that can't control where they are in the water. Plankton bloom, excuse me, is when something happens in the water, typically a lot of sun, a lot of nutrients, and the plankton, the plants, grow a lot, right? And you can typically see this if you go to the beach and the water isn't clear, but it has a lot of, it looks kind of opaque, kind of. That's a lot of plants in the water. You can't see them because you don't have a microscope, but they're there. Planktonette is how you collect plankton. It's essentially a net, right? Like a fishing net, but instead of a fishing net, you know, where the gap, the mesh in the net is maybe like this big, it's really small. It looks kind of like cloth, actually. Primary producer is another term really for autotroph. It's a primary producer is, we talked about the trophic pyramid in chapter 13. Primary producer is the bottom of the pyramid, right? It's the foundation for the food web. Primary productivity is how much carbon essentially, biomass, the primary producers make. Typically, primary productivity is measured over time. So, you know, month, day, year, whatever time you're using. Seagrass is another type of seaweed. It grows, trying to think, typically in shallow, warm waters like the Florida Keys. Sea turtles eat it a lot. Hawaii as well. There's a lot of seagrass. Tends to form beds on the bottom of the ocean. Thallus, don't worry about that one. Zooplankton is just plankton. That's an animal, right? So a jellyfish would be a zooplankton, technically. But there's also lots of little things as well. All right, so that's chapter 14 terms. Hope you enjoyed it. Let me know if you got questions.